Good morning. Welcome to the ultimate U2 after party. I know some of you have only slept a few hours, but I want to thank you for joining this presentation the morning after the concert. That is huge. I thought no one would show up except people from my own team who have to show up. So thank you so much for joining us here. How many of you are sci-fi fantasy geeks? Okay, you're my people. What I was thinking, so I'm going to make some science fiction. I'm going to make a lot of references to sci-fi movies. I'm a huge sci-fi fan, more sci-fi than fantasy. Star Wars is fantasy, I know. So if you don't get the references or the spoilers, there will be spoilers. You can ask the neighbor next to you. They'll probably be able to answer the questions. Some of them may be obscure, maybe not. So let me do the intro. My name is Rishi Dave. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at Dun & Bradstreet. Dun & Bradstreet is an iconic global company focused squarely in the data and analytics space. So we work with the smallest, hottest startups all the way up to 90% of the Fortune 500, really helping them grow by leveraging data and analytics for their sales and marketing strategies, risk management, finance, procurement, supply chain, compliance, all kinds of different ways that they can leverage data to grow. And so I thought a lot about how to talk about what's happening today in terms of how companies that are growing are leveraging analytics and data today to grow. And it feels like science fiction, but it's not. I'm not a futurist. I know you've heard a lot of futurists last couple days. I'm not a futurist. This is all real and all doable today. So I was watching Family Guy, and Family Guy has this excellent parody of Star Wars. So how many of you have seen it? The Star Wars parody? Excellent. They have this scene in the movie, in the show. Stewie, and if you don't know who Stewie is, ask your neighbor. He's playing Darth Vader, and he's talking to the commanders of the Empire, and he's saying to them, the rebels have the plans. Should we be worried? I'm paraphrasing. And the leaders on his staff, let's say, in the military, they said, doesn't matter. This is the most indestructible Death Star in the universe. Totally indestructible. So Stewie, playing Darth Vader, is like, awesome. So I'm not going to worry about the plans. And then the military leaders say, well, virtually indestructible. So he's like, I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask what you mean by that. He says, well, 99.99% indestructible. So he's like, well, what's that 0.01%? They're like, well, there's this little hole in the Death Star. It was really an aesthetic choice. If you shoot a laser through it, the entire thing will explode. And they said, nobody will do it. You have to fly down this whole trench for a long time. Nobody will exploit it. And then it gets really funny, where Stewie's basically saying, can you board it up? Can you do that? And they're like, I don't know if we really want to do that. And then they're like, okay, we can do it, but it's going to cost. And then they have this whole joke on budgeting and all that. It's really funny. But those of you who actually seen Star Wars know that that's not what actually happened. Darth Vader didn't really believe that that vulnerability existed, nor did he believe that it could be exploited. And so that's really the crux of what I want to talk about today. Because, although Darth Vader was, at the time, well, the Emperor was actually the most powerful person in the universe, I would argue, at the time, the Death Star still exploded. And many people joke around about that when they talk about Star Wars. They're like, well, how is that possible? Because, and most people chalk it up to, well, it makes a great movie, right? Having this vulnerability, this just makes a great movie and it's fun, and let's not argue about the logic. But it's totally possible, in the fantasy universe. In fact, it happens all the time in the real world. And I'm going to talk to you about some of these stories that all of you know, so I won't go too much into it. Huge enterprises are going away every single day. So since 2002, this is unbelievable. 50% of the Fortune 500 companies have disappeared, gone away, much like the Death Star went away. And what we find is that rebels in today's world, I'm not going to torture this analogy, don't worry, they come in all shapes and sizes. And they take down massive empires all the time. And we ask ourselves the same question, right? How did a small rebel force take down the Death Star? How did little startups, many of them here, take down or severely hurt some of these companies? And how is it possible that they didn't see it coming? It's very similar to how Darth Vader never saw it coming, which is what I like to say, the black swan event. How many of you are aware of this whole kind of black swan concept? Oh, wow, not as many people as expected. So here's what the black swan concept is. In the early 1600s, the empire in Europe basically thought that swans were only white, and swans only exist in that color. They never believed that there was any other color for swans. And they never believed that because all they saw in Europe were black swans. I mean, white swans. They never saw black swans. But, at some point, Europeans, Italians specifically, had the technology to actually explore the world. They went to Western Australia in around 1697, and then they saw a black swan. And all of a sudden, their entire worldview of swans changed because they realized that, oh my God, black swans actually exist. So what does that mean? What they learned is that looking at history doesn't necessarily tell you what's going to happen in the future, right? Because they only looked at white swans, so how is it possible that black swans exist? They were only looking at history. Secondly, people are incredibly arrogant. People who run companies become very complacent and arrogant, and they just don't believe that things will ever change, so they don't collect all the data that's available to them to reduce the chance that a black swan event could occur. And so how do you avoid a black swan event? Using all the resources at your disposal to try to minimize the risk that you're missing something that significant like a black swan event. And today, most enterprises do exactly that. They become very comfortable. They don't look at all the data and information that's available to them to minimize the risk of a black swan event occurring. And then they get hit by one, and it takes them down. In fact, it takes down half of the Fortune 500 since 2002. This is exactly what happened to Darth Vader, kind of. Hugely arrogant. I mean, the emperor was hugely arrogant, but so was Darth Vader. And it never occurred to them that a small rebel force could actually take down an entire Death Star, or that these type of vulnerabilities could actually exist. They could have just done a little bit of research, seen what the rebels were doing, seeing where they were accumulating forces, and very quickly try and look at the plans and very quickly figure out what they were going to do, and they didn't. And so this is exactly what happens in the real world all the time. So what I'm going to talk about today is what type of data and analytics is available to you now that you're not using that is increasing the probability, if your competitors are using it, to black swan you, meaning take you down. Because the real question that we should be asking ourselves is, how do we plan for the unthinkable in today's world? How do we leverage modern data, modern analytics to plan for the unthinkable when we can't just look at past data to predict the future, when the world is rapidly changing, and when many of us don't want to put the money or are too arrogant to believe that these changes are happening that could take your enterprise down, much like all the companies that we see that are being disrupted by companies in Silicon Valley. So let's talk through a little bit of the geek science here, and let's talk about how analytics is traditionally done. So we have a chief data scientist in the audience, so he's going to keep me honest. The way we do analytics is based on history. So we take a historical data set, and many times data scientists call it their training data set. We build a model from that training data set, and then we apply that model, regression model, to another data set and predict an outcome. Now, given everything I talked about, you can clearly see the holes in that methodology, where you're solely relying on history to predict the future. You're solely assuming that the environment and the world is not changing, and you're assuming that you actually have, that the data you have that you're training your model with is actually the totality or enough data to build the right model. None of that is true given what I've talked about so far. So what can you do today? And it's not science fiction, and we do it every day. The big change is the amount of data that's out there, how you can consume it in real time, and how you can leverage it to predict the environment that you're entering in the future. So let me peel that back a little bit. Dun & Bradstreet, which is the company I work for, we have the world's largest commercial database. We have 250 million business records. They're updated real time 5 million times a day with 30,000 proprietary data sources. Now, imagine being able to consume that data in real time and leverage that to build your models. That's exactly what the growing enterprises are doing today. They're essentially what we call predict the predictors. So let me give you a very practical example. Let's say that you're doing a marketing response model, which is a very kind of standard traditional model that people have been doing for the last 100 years in marketing. What you do is you look at an old campaign. You look at, OK, how did companies respond? How did your customers respond to that campaign? You build your model, and then you apply it to another data set to predict how companies respond to that. But what if you could actually consume real-time data and know not just how a particular data set will respond, but which companies you should actually target based on what's happening to them real time in terms of predicting what they do. So, for example, today, when we build our models and determine what customers to target, we look at real time with those 5 million updates a day, which companies are increasing their vendor base, which companies have changing credit scores, which companies are investing in their infrastructure, which companies are building new relationships with new companies, and a whole host of other data that changes on a daily basis. When we see changes in that data, we can predict which companies are going to grow based on that real-time data, and which companies are going to decline or go flat. And what you find is those companies, the historical data will never tell you that. So, for example, a lot of companies that may not have been growing for a while, all of a sudden, in real time, you see that the management is changing, they're getting influx of VC investment, they're all of a sudden investing in a whole host of infrastructure, their credit scores are improving. All these kind of things we know indicate that a company is growing. Once we know what companies are growing in the future, and again, the past doesn't tell, then we know that we should target them for our marketing campaigns, et cetera. Now, why is that powerful? Because your competitors are not doing that. They're either looking at historical data, or they're looking at some other traditional means to figure out what companies to target, for example. So that gives you the differentiation. And over time, you start targeting the right companies, and they start getting the wrong companies. And that's how you black swan them, if that can be a verb. Did I explain that correctly? Thank you, Andy. He doesn't, like, we have this conversation, he's our chief data scientist, of like, marketers kind of think very differently than chief data scientists, so explain that to him. Yes, they do. So this is not science fiction, this is happening today. And the smallest companies in the world up to the largest enterprises can leverage this real-time data to make decisions. So how is that possible? First of all, obviously, we have to have the ability to process this data in real time. We now have that ability. So this data, if we look at our smaller business customers, they're consuming this data through their cloud-based marketing technology stacks. So we embed the data into those stacks, like data.com, and they can consume the data. And obviously, the cloud has the processing power that a small business may not have. For a lot of the big enterprises, they receive the data real time every day through APIs from the cloud that goes into their systems. What companies do is they take that real-time data and marry it with their own data within their own systems, whether it's web traffic data or it's data they get from their procurement systems or their customer service systems. And they can build these differential models to predict which companies are growing, declining in the future, and use that to target versus solely looking at history. And what's interesting is, here's the sci-fi parallel, is that the big differentiator here is not only having access to that real-time data, but also having that clean data set that's integrated. And one thing I noticed as you look at the sci-fi universe is that sci-fi villains who actually have good data are the ones that are the hardest to kill. So let me give you an example. If you look at like Star Trek and Q is the most powerful entity in the universe. He can't be killed. But you look at Star Wars like Jabba the Hutt, this analogy is not working. I had this huge slide, and my team took it out, and I'm trying to put it back in. And you look at Jabba the Hutt or some of these other, or the Daleks or things like that, where they're not actually managing their data, right? They're easily killed, right? And then you look at the Borg, not as powerful as Q, but the Borg, see, you like this analogy, but the Borg still has great data quality, right? So this is exactly analogous to your company. Are you using all the data available to you in real time, these 5 million updates a day? And you can today, it's not science fiction. Secondly, merging the past and the present. So old school analytics doesn't go away. You still have to look at the past. As well, when you're consuming the real-time data, you have to understand what that real-time data is telling you about where those companies are going. And so those models still matter, and past models still matter when it comes to changes in that real-time data. The difference is that you're getting it now and you're applying it to the future versus solely looking at history. So you are merging the past and the present when you build your analytical models. Thirdly, and I've kind of beaten a dead horse, is real-time signals. So you have to have the ability to consume these real-time changes that are happening in your potential customer base every single day. And these are hundreds of fields on millions of companies that you potentially want to target. And again, we now have the ability to do it through APIs from the cloud or just using your existing marketing tech stack where a lot of the data that I've described is already embedded into the stack. Or through the connections you make across all your data sets. So the ability to process real-time signals is doable and happening now for all size companies. And lastly, of course, perpetual learning. Because you can't rely on history, you have to continuously improve your models on a real-time basis as you start getting real data in and you start to see what's working and what's not working in terms of changes in real-time data. So, what is the difference between the past and the present way of doing analytics? In the past, we looked at analytics as being solely predictive. And we didn't have the technology, processing power, even data sets available to us to do anything more sophisticated than look at past historical data that we had, build models from that data, and then start to predict the future. But as I mentioned, there are a lot of fallacies to that approach, given that the past doesn't predict the future, and there's a whole host of additional data available that you're not using that your competitors or a startup will quickly use to disrupt. Anticipatory you still do predictive, but then you bring in real-time data through modern technology that you use to what I call predict the predictors. So predictor may be what customers you target and where those customers will be over time, and targeting those customers that are growing in a direction that you care about versus declining or going flat. And again, the past does not predict where these companies will necessarily go. Real-time data and real-time behavior of those companies in terms of their borrowing, their credit, their relationships with other companies, all that stuff, and that data is constantly in motion. That is what you use to start to figure out who you target in the future at scale. So let me give you some practical case studies of how this is applied. The most basic way, and this is something that we do in our organization every day, is using account-based marketing. What companies should you target? So once you know what spaces you're in and what spaces you want to sell to and the type of company you want to sell to, what we do is we actually look at existing customers and potential customers and leverage the real-time data to figure out which companies are growing in the direction that would increase demand for our solutions. And we target them versus ones that are going to decline. Now imagine over time what this is giving us the ability to do. We are targeting a lot of enterprises for a lot of opportunities that our competitors are not. And we're seeing real pipeline growth from that targeting process. And the companies that we're not targeting, because they may be declining, they may have been doing well historically, that's who our competitors are going for. And over time, we get the good accounts, they get the bad accounts, and we have a differential position. We also use the same type of analytics to prioritize what salespeople get what accounts. Because again, what most companies do is they look at current spend with the account, or they'd say, oh, this is a big account. We should give it to our top salespeople. Oh, it's a small company. We should give it to our inside salespeople. When in reality, the biggest opportunity you could have is a company that's small, but is heavily investing in growth, heavily getting funding, increasing their vendor base, improving their credit scores, and other 100 variables. And that's who you should be actually putting your top sales reps on. And these are the people that your competitors are ignoring. And they also tend to have a lot of money if they're well-funded versus large enterprises. We've gotten so much success with this approach that we actually embed in the Salesforce dashboard of our salespeople what companies they should target for what opportunity and what the size of that opportunity is based on where we predict that company is going using real-time data. And obviously, we can update that on a daily basis. Another great example is bank loan decisions. And this is just a cool example that I pulled from one of our customers, huge financial services company. And they actually came up with this brilliant idea leveraging what I just described. So they get asked for loans all the time from all kinds of companies of all sizes. They asked an interesting question. They said, wait a minute, like we don't know why these companies are asking for loans, and they won't necessarily tell us. So for example, are they asking us for a loan because they're about to tank and they need money, or something bad is happening to them? Or are they asking us for money because they're about to do heavy investment for growth? Now, leveraging this real-time data that they get and they consume from us, they can actually understand why or predict why this particular company is coming for a loan based on where they're going in the future. And they leverage that to make loan decisions that differentiate them from their competition. So there's lots and lots of case studies in terms of how to use this. But the fundamental thing we're trying to do is not rely on history, but we're trying to rely on this real-time data. We're consuming it, which we can now do, and we're using it to build models and predict the future, and we're not relying on purely historical data to do so. So, parting words of wisdom. I think I've beaten this quite a bit. It's not just about historical data. If you're just using historical data or just building these models based on data that you personally have based on history, you're probably being very arrogant. And you're probably missing huge opportunities that your competitors will find. And if you doubt it, then just look at the Fortune 500 and how many have gone away not believing that that's actually happening to them. Clearly, the world is rapidly transforming, and most companies are not capturing that in their ability to make decisions. But you can capture it easily today because you have real-time data sets that change and will tell you what's exactly happening in real time. And lastly, and this is what I want to really leave you with, is if you're not using all the analytics, all the data, and all the technology at your disposal, then you will be disrupted. Because that's exactly the #1 way to avoid a black swan event, is to not be arrogant, look at all the information available to you, leverage everything you can to minimize the probability of that happening to you, whether it's through a competitor or some other event. And so I encourage all of you to really look at whether you're using everything that's available to you. And by the way, if you're a Salesforce customer, you already have it available to you in data.com. So thank you so much. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. We have a lot of swag, cool swag, lots of cool swag for people who ask questions. So please, thank you very much. Thank you for coming the morning after the U2 concert. And let's do questions. And we have our chief data scientist here, too, if you ask something truly nerdy. Questions. You get hats. Cool hats, not just like baseball caps. Trucker hats. And the trucker hats say data on them. Data, and what is it, in love, right? Data and love. So you can, if you need to convince your CIO to invest in data, you can give them a hat. Any questions? Yes? Yeah, you can go up there. Yeah.
Sir, I work at a high-tech company in IT, working a lot with analytics. So we're starting to get better and better analytics to actually serve up to say, hey, look, we think this could be an opportunity. But our sales team is not as open to it because they have been growing and they just they think they know their accounts better than what we do.
Yep.
So there's kind of that adaptation of, hey, we think we've got something really great for you. Can you take a look at it?
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about how that transition went for your company and how they started to embrace it and how they did that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you asked that question because I did a session yesterday on account-based marketing. That was like the first. Were you there?
Yeah.
That was like that was also like a theme that came up after the session. The way you do that is a combination of science and qualitative, which I think I might have talked about yesterday, where you use the science to prioritize the accounts, and then you work with your sales team to understand the intuition behind that. So what we did was we said, okay, so here are the biggest opportunity accounts. Do you agree based on your understanding of the accounts? And that could help us not only validate the models, but also capture items that the data may not capture to get a better prioritization. And then we jointly prioritize the accounts, leveraging the data and their knowledge, and we both owned it. Second thing we did was we started with just 10 accounts, just a small subset of accounts that we saw the biggest opportunity, and we showed success with those 10 accounts with an account-based approach, as I talked about yesterday. And once we had those successes and the sales team understood that the successes, then we started scaling it after.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. And you have to give him a hat because he came to yesterday's session, I remember. Questions? How many people have read Ready Player One? Oh, yeah. I can't believe only one person has read it. You read it. Yeah, yeah. It's going to be a movie. When the movie's coming out, Steven Spielberg is making the movie. Anyways. Yes?
I'll ask a question.
Yes.
So what if in your company you can't afford at this time to hire a data scientist? All you've got is historical data.
Do you want to answer that? OK, come on. Chief data scientist, let's do it. Make you work. Be careful, he'll start singing.
There's no non-awkward way to do this, sorry. So the question was, what if you can't afford to hire people that can do all this data science? And the answer is you already have them, right? So the first step in doing any of this is to just accept what are the resources that you have in your organization, and how can you expand that? There are user communities, there's always going to be someone in your organization that does analysis, does some sort of analytics. So you start with that skill gap and you say, what do I need to do to take one step? Don't try to focus on the whole journey. So Rishi's talking a lot about real-time data, and you might be sitting there thinking, well, how is that even possible? Like, I can't know something happened the minute it happens. When you say real-time data, you mean in the moment we see it.
Right,
right?
Absolutely.
And so the distinction there, the data you collected a minute ago is not 1 minute old. But if you wait a month to use it, you just took day-old bread and made it month-old bread, right? So the whole point is to just get better and better and better at what you're doing in your organization. There are user communities that you can join. There are resources that are available for free. There's open source resources. I would caution you to be careful. The gentleman that said that he's in the previous question, you know, I would imagine, I can't see where you are, the lights. Lots of, analytics, lots of capabilities, lots of stuff, right? Well, really great visualizations on top of crappy data are, really great visualizations of crappy data, right? So to understand the data, there's some basic blocking and tackling that everyone can do. You don't need to be hiring like, Einstein to come in and do this. Of course that helps, and that is probably step 4, but you can take step 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah, and even something as basic as, data.com, for example, which is part of Salesforce, just pulling in that data into your CRM to supplement and link your data at the most basic level, before you even start building models, that will give you an incredible amount of information that your sales team and you can use to plan out your account strategies or whatever. You don't even need a data scientist for that. I mean, you just need to turn on data.com and then just bring in that data and clean up your CRM, and that will give you an incredible amount of information that you can use to nurture leads, to prioritize accounts, all those kind of things, before you start bringing in a data scientist to do more sophisticated modeling. Did you get a hat?
Oh, yeah.
OK, good.
Sorry, so in the Star Wars universe, the Death Star has been blown up 3 times now?
Yes, and somebody brought that up yesterday to me. Yeah, I mean, I'm very aware of that, but I have a good response. Go ahead.
And so I was curious, is there some sort of analogy here where highly organized but bureaucratic organization is always going to lose to a smaller, more flexible company or group? And if that's true, how, if you're in a very bureaucratic company, how do you move them, or how do you have some advice on how to move them to a more flexible, faster modeling approach?
So the example of the Death Star exploding 3 times, the first time you don't expect it, right? The second and third time is just, I was going to say stupid, but just bureaucracy, where you're not learning from actual failures to improve. And so I don't think it's just big companies that suffer that, or any size companies, because there are a lot of large companies that are continually paranoid about disruption and do learn from their mistakes. You could argue Salesforce is a huge company. Amazon, there's a lot of these big companies that actually, when unexpected occurs, they actually make sure it doesn't happen again. But you're right, more companies than not actually have their Death Star explode 3, 4 times, because it happens once, and then there's a new management team, but the processes are still there, the bureaucracy is still there, et cetera. So what I would say is the biggest thing you can do is culture and fixing processes and fixing bureaucracy. So what I did at Dun & Bradstreet is I came in 3 years ago and a new management team came in to really grow the company. We all focus first and foremost on culture and saying, okay, what space do we play in? What processes are there that we can get rid of that are stupid? How do we create a acceptance of failure, test and learn, all those kind of things? And then how do we make rational data and analytics-based decisions? Those kind of things help cut through a lot of that bureaucracy in what you do. And celebrating failures is a big one. Because when you do get hit by a mini black swan, maybe a gray swan event, and that's actually a term, how do you actually learn from that failure and improve in the future? So we have a division of our company that has a huge failure wall where they actually celebrate people who have failed. They put it up on a wall so everyone else can learn from it and not let it happen again. So all those kind of things are very important to do it.
So being a part of a business that has some risk aversion markets, how do you take real-time data and filter out the anomalies so you don't make a course correction based on an anticipatory
You want to take it? Yeah.
predictor that says, hey, this is an anomaly and this isn't the way that's trending?
Yeah. That's like a dream. You just asked a dream question for a data scientist.
That is absolutely one of the most important questions you can ask when you're using new types of data is how do I know I'm not just getting distracted by a squirrel, right? So on the one side, you've got the voice on one shoulder is saying, well, there's all these new types of data, big data, these things that we've never seen before, and they can allow us to do new things. And then on the other side, you see, yeah, but just because you see something one time doesn't make it anything other than having seen it one time. There are disciplines, sorry, I'm going to sound like I'm being hypocritical now. In data science, there are hard disciplines for this. One is something called supersaturation. You see an observation at the event horizon of the organization. It suggests that maybe there is a direction being taken that's new. And then you form that hypothesis. This happens algorithmically. You form that hypothesis, and then you test that hypothesis as you ingest new pieces of data, and you either confirm or refute that hypothesis, and this can happen automatically. Another one is something called heuristic analysis, where you watch people who have these giant brains in between their ears who can look at that data and say, well, I've never seen this before. Here's an x-ray with something on it that I've never seen before. You watch a whole bunch of doctors looking at that x-ray, and you watch how they behave, and you build algorithms to behave the way they do. So we don't know what they're doing, but we're doing the same thing. So we're at least as good as them. So those are just two examples, supersaturation and heuristics. There's like 100 more. It's extremely agile. You have to be careful that in that agility you don't introduce a lot of volatility, right? So if you react to everything, then what's going to happen is your system becomes unstable, and then you can't even measure how it's performing. So you have to strike a balance. There's a little art and there's a little science in this, but the very first step, there's always a first step, is asking that question. And I can't stress enough that doing nothing is a choice, right? If you don't do anything, that's not necessarily making you safer. Sometimes it can include, the question, does it include looking at historical anomalies? It can if you're looking at the same type of data as you've seen in the past. Very often these things happen with data you've never seen before. We look at fraud, right? When fraudsters commit fraud, they're trying to commit it in a new way, right? If you only model the way they've behaved, you're going to catch the way they used to behave, and you know that they're behaving differently, so you're modeling what they're not doing, right? So it depends on the type of thing that you're looking at. If you're looking at, star movements, yeah, absolutely. Go look at the past 1,000 years of history. Go back to Copernicus. But if you're looking at things that have never happened before, historically unprecedented, Brexit happens, and you're looking at the behavior of organizations around something that has never happened before, don't go look in your historical data.
Yeah, there's also a notion called anti-fragility, which actually, and it's the same guy who wrote Black Swan, and essentially what it says is, it's okay to fail. We failed a lot of times in our models, but that allows you to learn as well, right? So you may not know what the anomalies are because you're not looking at historical data. It's all new data, and you're looking forward, but that gives you a lot of information on how to refine your models going forward. And so, not doing something, it's better to do something and do a lot and then see where your failures are to refine the model going forward. And that's exactly what we did. So we're out of time, but Anthony and I will hang out after this meeting if you have any other questions. But thank you so much.